So the topic here is authentication and authorization, kind of taking a step back away from some of the details that if you're a part of PDG or OCI that we've been in, and just taking a kind of a broader look at how these tools are used. So first, if we're looking at DSCSA, one of our challenges is that this is a network, kind of a loose network of for the enhanced drug distribution security system, especially when you're thinking about verification of products or tracing products. For TI exchange, providing transaction information to a customer or receiving it from a supplier, you've probably gone through authentication and authorization processes, onboarding processes in order to understand who your customer or supplier is, whether they are an authorized trading partner or an authorized trading partner equivalent. So those entities are entities that from an ATP standpoint, they may not necessarily have a license or a registration with the FDA, but they are trading partners. And we always pick on the VA as a easily understood entity that's a authorized trading partner, what we would consider authorized trading partner equivalent. So if you think about this sort of highly distributed system, especially again, when we're thinking about verification of products or tracing of products, although you may know who your immediate trading partner is, if you're a manufacturer, you may receive verification for a product from someone or a company that you don't do direct business with. And so authorization and authentication of that entity before you provide information to them is an important step, and there's different ways you can manage that. Likewise, if you're a wholesaler or a dispenser, and especially in a trace environment where you may get a trace request from an entity that is claiming to be either a manufacturer, a repackager, a wholesaler, an authority, knowing whether they are who they indeed say they are in that electronic environment and whether they're authorized for that information is important. Another area that's important is what you do with that information. So we're trying to manage all of this information so that you can access it directly. And if you think about that authentication and authorization process that you go through, not only with your customers, but with these other entities that may contact you around verifications or tracing. One of the areas that we need to be mindful of is that not only transaction information is necessary to archive, but also when we're talking about investigations. And so I just clipped this out of the DSCSA statute. And so you see here the same requirements for manufacturers, wholesalers, dispensers. I probably could have grabbed them from repackagers also, but in the case of an investigation, and especially when we're looking at tracing, so tracing is usually done in the process of doing an investigation, whether that's a suspect product or an illegitimate product. And indeed, verifications are most likely going to be done in those cases also to determine the status of that product. But you see here also, not only is it TI information that we need to keep for 6 years, but also all of the information around an investigation. So whether you receive a request for information, whether that's a verification or a trace, or you're provided information in an investigation for a verification or a trace, that information needs to be captured, and that also includes who it is that you're exchanging that data with. So again, the theme of authentication or authorization, and being able to look back and if you are required to provide that information of who that information was exchanged with. Any thoughts, again, as a roundtable and not just a straight out presentation? Any thoughts or questions around this area? I see there's a, okay. I see Chris put up the link to the one pager that we're kind of focusing on. Okay, so we'll come back to this. So a very challenging environment, very distributed system, if you will, and I use system as in quotes in that it's not a single, obviously not a single system, but a number of systems that are interacting with each other. PI verification and trace records are part of that official record, and who you're exchanging information or getting information from is part of that record also. So the authentication and authorization parts of that. So let's see if my slide works here. So from a fundamental design principles, before we even get into how this occurs or the processes that have been identified for doing authentication and authorization in a and again, we're only talking about verification and tracing. For TI exchange, we're using our individual onboarding processes for that. So again, from a fundamental security design principles point of view, authentication is the process of verifying the entity that's requested or provided information. And if we're mindful of the distributed environment, the fact that this is happening electronically, even though you may know if someone provides you with their, let's say, an identifier, it could be a global location number, GLN, just because they provide that to you, it doesn't mean that they actually are that entity. We need to be careful about some of these identifiers that are easy to find out or discover and then use. And then authorization, whether they actually are an ATP, an authenticated trading partner, and should have access to that information. And lastly, down at the bottom, and this is part of the PDG blueprint, is that we're providing means of identifying whether the entity asking for information or providing information is either an authorized trading partner equivalent. Again, think of something like a VA that is not required to have those the same kind of records that the ATP has, or a DSCSA authority such as the FDA or state boards of pharmacy. So when you think about this, if we're in a verification or a trace environment, someone is either asks us for information or is providing us information. How do we authenticate and authorize them? And so there's two different ways that we've worked out within the within the PDG blueprint, and that we've been supporting within OCI. And hopefully this is clear enough to understand. If digital credentials are being used, then the authentication and authorization happens within your digital wallet, and that wallet is actually authenticating the identity of the opposite trading partner that's either asking for information or providing information. They're doing cryptographic verification of the credential presentation itself, whether they've signed it, they've allowed their signature to be used to say, I am asking for this information, and then authorizing the information that's actually in that credential. So in this case, authorizing doing a cryptographic check of the information in that credential, checking the signature of the issuer of the credential to make sure everything is correct, and also checking the revocation registry for that digital credential to make sure that credential is still valid at this point in time. So that all takes place within the digital wallet, takes place in under a second, and then you know whether either you've received information from the entity that you've been interacting with, or you're sending information to the correct entity. Outside of that environment, there may be some work to be done in order to do this authentication authorization. Again, unlike TI Exchange, where you've set up secure direct mechanism for exchanging information with your trading partners, this is almost an ad hoc situation where you've received a request for information from an entity that you don't have a direct connection with necessarily, or you've received either verification information or trace information from an entity that you may not have a direct connection with. In that case, you'll need to take the information that you've either received or providing and verify that entity's identity, and also verify whether they are an ATP equivalent or a DSCSA authority using the information that's available to you. And now I believe in both verification and tracing. If you're receiving a verification request or a trace request, there is contact information in both of those messages, and so that's available to you to then be able to use your own internal checks to be able to verify their identity, whether they've actually sent you this request, and then you can also be able to look up the information to determine whether they are an ATP or not, or an authority or equivalent. Likewise, if you get a response, either a verification response or a trace response, there is contact information in those messages also that you can manually do those checks that you need to do in order to authenticate and authorize that entity. Any thoughts or questions around these two methods for authenticating and authorizing within a PI verification or a TI request, trace request or response?
Yeah, hi Bob. This is Charles from Prosperity. I'm sure you mentioned it, but I just want to highlight that basically two things. I mean, we talk here about real-time, basically real-time information, yeah, because what we do with the VRS, that if you scan a product and you expect a verification response from a manufacturer as a dispenser, you don't want to wait for 10 minutes, and the system is not built to wait for 10 minutes. So you need to have directly the information if the product is the product identifier is in good standing, and if it comes from an authorized trading partner. So the system is built to have real-time information. And and I don't know how you and I think in some of the PDG calls lately it was discussed that companies had challenges also identifying, or challenges with manufacturers had challenges knowing the GLNs or finding verifying a GLN in a PI verification request. Maybe you can also talk a little bit about this and how this is connected.
Verifying that the entity was the entity of the GLN, or verifying or looking up information about that GLN.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just like any identifier, and not to just pick on GLNs, in cases where even someone might be using a DEA code, those are easily found out. Those identifiers and could be used, and there are sometimes mistakes made, or a company may have a number of GLNs for different purposes, and they may not always be published or understood as to what company that actually is. So there's two items. One is finding out the information about that identifier, and the second one is, which I think is almost the more of the security aspect of this, is determining whether the entity that is contacting me electronically is that entity. And I always talk about that that cartoon where there's the two dogs and one's on a computer, and he says to the dog on the ground, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. And that's the situation we're in here, especially with PI verification and tracing, is that because this is much different than what occurs with TI exchange, where you actually go through an onboarding process with your customer or supplier. In this case, it's very ad hoc. And to your point, real time, especially in the case of verification. So today, if you do a verification, you receive an immediate response. For tracing, you have the responder has 24 hours to respond, and they'll be doing quite a bit of work in looking at the request, understanding the investigation that's ongoing, and whether they have other information about that, and then providing the response. And they may be working with a number of groups within their companies. So certainly their legal department, their compliance department. So that 24 hours is very short in order to engage all of those that are needed. And on top of it, do the authentication or authorization of the either requester or responder. Any other thoughts about this kind of area? This is a rather unusual set of requirements on an industry to do this sort of. Again, I keep referring to this as ad hoc because of these two areas here, where typically all of your messages flow between known trading partners, and I can never come up with another example where companies are required to interact and provide confidential information, essentially, to another entity that they've not gone through an onboarding process. And so, again, why the focus here between authentication and authorization, and understanding those two steps and how the credentials allow us to do that securely. Okay. So in terms of the work that's been done around the credentials, it's and I'll go down to this one down. Let me see if I can. Oops, not that one. Let's try. The work that's been done and the standards that are being used around these, and where they may have already been either been used or the type of work that's been done. And the one area we left off here was the NIST standard for authenticating the identity of another trading partner or another entity. And this is the step where the issuer is going through to identify the entity that's requested either an ATP equivalent, or a DSCSA authority credential. The largest step there is determining whether the entity that's asking for that, because this is essentially the doorway to the EDDS system, we're using the standardizing on the NIST standards for identity. And maybe I see David's on the line. David, I'm sorry to call you out real quick. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that. step, because it's, we're so focused on ATP that I think a lot of the work that's been done is really the step that happens before that, which is determining identity.
Hey, Bob, good morning. Sure, yeah. So what we're trying to do is exactly that, right? We're trying to use a standard that's in place, one that is familiar to the industry that we can base assurance on. And so you're right, there are three levels of assurance defined by NIST. And so we are using basically a level two assurance, which is the highest level assurance that can be done on an identity without actually being face to face with somebody. And so that is the idea that there are proof elements, documents, and such that are gathered, reviewed, and then based on proving the authenticity of those documents and that identity, then that level of assurance has been reached. And so it doesn't define that you have to have a particular document. It just, it basically ranks documents like things that are weak or moderate or strong or superior in a level of proving someone's identity. Like a passport would be a very high level to prove a individual's identity. So you could imagine there's documents and things that are available for a company to also prove their identity. So if you bring enough of those things together, you can determine that they are who they say they are to that level of assurance. And again, we see this particularly um, done for years in the DEA space with controlled substances, in proving that a signer for a controlled substance, a Schedule II narcotic, is who they say they are and has the ability to sign on behalf of their company as a power of attorney in order to buy those drugs from a supplier. So that is also a level two assurance that the DEA does, or they do through a third party. So basically, that process of proving out an identity of someone is what we're applying here for this purpose of identity assurance for a company. So again, to bring it back around, just stating that we know who we're talking to at the company. It's a representative that has control over these things, and that they can, vouch for their company's identity. So once that's been proven, then we can kind of check that box that it's been proven up to that level of assurance, and then move on to the next step, which is what you had talked about with ATP status, authorized trading partner status. Hopefully that
Thanks.
helps summarize it.
Any questions or thoughts?
And I guess the only thing to add to that would be, Bob, you kind of touched on what the risk is if we don't do that, right? Because of what we're dealing with not just direct trading partners, but indirect trading partners, making sure that we can trust that particular correspondence between an indirect trading partner and yourself is paramount. And so that's the idea here, is to let everybody know what level of assurance we're dealing with. And then once we've determined that, then we can, we've established that trust. And then moving forward, we're just making sure that their authorized trading partner status is in place so that we know they have the right registration or the license to do what they need to do for transaction level information.
Yeah, and I think it surprised me when we first started doing this. And again, I have to come back to the fact that I think this is pretty unique. I don't know if anybody knows of another situation. Certainly we do this in B2C interactions where we don't know the customer, the consumer. And so we go through that interaction, if they're trying to purchase something off of our website or something like that, we go through an authentication authorization at minimal level at least. But from a B2B perspective, the fact that any one of these entities could send you an electronic request for information. If you're a manufacturer or repackager, it could be a verification. If you're anyone else, it could be a trace request. And then determining who they are is, I think that was a little bit of an eye-opener to me, that although we have been focusing on authorized trading partner, just as you normally do in TI exchange or any kind of customer and supplier interaction, you go through your onboarding process and you know who your customers are and you know who your suppliers are. But in this case, we're dealing with a situation where you may not know who is asking you for information. And again, layering on top of that, you need to keep that information for 6 years after an investigation. And certainly in the case of tracing only occurs if we're looking at the PDG blueprint. Tracing only occurs in the event of an investigation, whether that's a suspect product, illegitimate product, recall product investigation. Jumping around here too fast. Sorry about that. So, and I think maybe George, you were trying to prompt me before, but I couldn't come up with a good example for you. But as we're starting to use these systems, the verification processes, tracing processes, as we start to explore those processes and actually exercise them and use them, I think there's two things we're realizing. One is that mistakes happen, things happen. People use the wrong GLN, let's say, for example, when they're doing a verification, and that's occurred. We've seen that happen. In which case you would get information back based on someone else's data. And I guess the second item, which we're all concerned about, is also in the case of nefarious activities. Where in this case, it could be someone that's trolling for information. They could be a nefarious actor that is looking to maybe possibly counterfeit product and discover serial numbers and that are legitimate that they could potentially use. It may be a nefarious actor in the middle of the supply chain somewhere that is trying to provide, I would say, if you're going to provide counterfeit or stolen product, you're also going to provide the verification of that and also tracing information, illegitimate tracing information. So those are the things we're concerned about, that we try to think through to make sure all of this hangs together securely. I know that we've been at this for in the case of DSCSA, 10 years and doing a lot of happy path, and that's been hard enough. But now we're starting to experience, especially in exceptions processing, where exceptions occur, and we're trying to either recover or work through those exceptions of if someone provides erroneous identifiers, how do we work through that?
Hey, Bob, since you called on me again, you called on me before, I'm going to talk again.
Okay.
So what that overview just made me think about is, not just establishing the trust and the identity of who you're talking to, which is important, but also establishing the fact that that particular, let's say, Board of Pharmacy license is in control or is controlled by the company or the identity that's been established, right? Because just like you mentioned earlier, there are certain unique IDs, numbers, things that identify companies that can be found fairly easily. So, if someone was going to be some type of a bad actor and they wanted to find a valid license, even one in a town that they're representing that they're in, it can be found, right? They could find a valid license, they could present that license to establish their ATP. So that's why it's so important to establish they are who they say they are. So making sure that identity is true and that license that they're presenting, or that registration that they're presenting based on their role in the supply chain, that is actually in control of that company, right? And so it allows both of those checks with the credentialing process to be done, both the identity as well as that ATP check, and that they're linked, that they're controlling that license. So I just want to add that finer point as you brought up those other elements there.
Yeah, and I think it's, I mean, we've heard some, and I don't want to go too deep into the dark side of this, which is the nefarious activity, but it is good to understand the lengths at which these folks will go through in order to counterfeit your company, counterfeit your product, counterfeit your company, counterfeit your website, counterfeit your TI data, and now start to consider whether they could counterfeit verifications, counterfeit tracing information. And there's a number of examples out there. There's a number of books out there. I know the oldest one, which is, this is examples out of 1999, but it's still out there. Whoops, that's kind of tiny, isn't it? And so this is an interesting book just to get an idea of the lengths at which someone will go through in order to profit from, again, counterfeiting your products and your company. Let's go back here. Sorry, I had my things out of order there. So as we start to exercise the system now, both from a TI exchange, but also in verification, verification now that dispensers are starting to be able to verify products. And as we move into tracing, so we're starting to exercise some of the tracing of products and the TI requests and responses. We start to now see this, what I've been referring to as the ad hoc nature of the EDDS system. And so as you start to experiment with that, you can start to think through, again, purely mistakes being made, and how you recover from that. How do you detect that? Is this the entity that this identifier really is purporting to be? And also, sort of the nefarious side of this is someone trying to gather information, whether it's for business purposes or for nefarious purposes.
Okay, Bob, may I add a perspective?
Sure.
On this? So, I mean, what you're mentioning, or what you're saying is 100% true. And maybe to add on this, that that this, in order to have DSCSA compliance on individual trading partner sites, there have to be interoperable solutions in place. And these solutions that are currently being developed in, be it now in EPCS data exchange or in product verifications, they are actually interoperable, which is a tremendous effort, and it's a great achievement to enable very efficient data sharing between solution providers, and of course then the end result also between trading partners. But as you said earlier, and that's why we are talking here now, is we need to ensure that we share only data with authorized companies, and the requirement to have, as David explained earlier, a mechanism to really know who the other side is something we developed in the OCI, and that and this is at the end and also knowing, like, this credentialing is also so interoperable that it can be resolved by any solution provider who's working in this area, and that's why it's so super interesting. It's just a thought what I wanted to add on the discussion earlier.
So I depicted. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, this is Sharon. One of the
Sharon?
things, yeah, hi there, everyone. Um, the thing that, and I'm just based on my experience over the years, whenever we had any sort of inquiry from the market, and I'm even talking pre-DSCSA, right? For any sort of information regarding transactions, authenticity of verification of product, the most effort and time that was put in was in quote unquote authenticating the requester,
Mm.
understanding who the requester was it an appropriate request that we should respond to, etc. Garnering the information on product identity and all that from a manufacturing standpoint, even pre DSCSA, we had mechanisms in place to pull that information together fairly quickly. We spent a lot more effort and time in saying, who is this person? Who is this entity? Should we respond? What are they asking? So I see this as an opportunity because we always had to engage with our security people and all of that for that sort of vetting, right? And so this is the benefit I see of what you're offering here. Just my piece. Okay.
Yeah, Sharon, that's interesting. Being able to go through that process and then, as you said, uh, bring in all those other groups, like you mentioned, security. Obviously, you're in compliance. You may have to bring in legal at some point if it's. I'm sure that if it was an authority question, you just don't want a knee-jerk respond. You need to make sure not only is the question appropriate, but what information are we providing before we send it out.
Yeah. But again, it was really most the effort was on whom is the requester. And I can tell
Mm-hmm.
you, there have been times when we have had our product security people literally fly out to, to put eyes on the requester to ensure that they were a real person, real entity, and stuff. So again, this credentialing will save us a lot of time and effort on that side.
Yeah, essentially what it's doing is not waiting to the request to lock down that information and lock down that status. But if everyone does that beforehand, then all of this becomes a lot smoother, and these interactions can go forward with security.
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
and I don't know how else you do this, given the timeframes that are in the law for responding to a request. And there's a whole there's a whole argument around that. When does the timeline? When does the time clock start? Is it upon the request, or is it upon determining who they are? Which may be a more appropriate answer.
The clock always starts when you receive the request.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
David, maybe you may have gone through this already in what you were speaking about before, but again, the links that as an issuer, and this is all part of the OCI conformance criteria for issuers, the links that you go through, based on what Sharon just said, to make that determination of who the entity is. A lot of times we think about some of the larger companies, and of course we all know who, and I won't mention any names. These large companies are, but there's a lot of players in the supply chain, and you're essentially having to do what Sharon talked about, which is how do I tell who this person is? So maybe you can just focus a little bit on the kinds of things that you do. I think you already did, but just now that we've had Sharon kind of add a little emphasis to this as an issuer that you're doing on behalf of the industry, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So there's an, just like Sharon mentioned, there's an onboarding process, right? And so once an applicant has their digital wallet, right, which is where the credentials are stored and utilized, and that's where the magic's happening, right? That's where the security and cryptography and all those things around utilizing those credentials take place in exchanges with the VRS transactions, whether it's tracing, whether it's PI verification. So those things are happening by utilizing the credential that's in that holder, right, that company's wallet. But as the applicant, in order to get those credentials, they will be moved to the process of onboarding, and that's where they're establishing who they are, right? And there's decisions for companies to make. Are they going to set up as a corporation that might respond with all the requests for their different subsidiaries, or is each subsidiary going to stand up themselves and respond? And so there's ways, there's business decisions that have to be made. But once that's been done, then it's a fairly straightforward process. Hey, this is my company. This is the address of my company. Here are documents or other forms in order to prove I am who I say I am. So those are submitted during the onboarding process, and depending on the type of information submitted, it could be a few minutes to a few hours that it takes to process through that. Again, to reference what Sharon said, it's a hefty process in order to make sure that you can identify somebody, right? And so it's nothing we take lightly. But you go into the process, you get that established, and then once you can verify that they are who they say they are, then you're also utilizing the information based on their role in the supply chain, as a manufacturer, a wholesaler, a dispenser, what they need to also provide to prove ATP status, right? So is it a FEI number? Is it a FEI number and a Board of Pharmacy number? And so then that information is checked to make sure that it is controlled by the identity that we just proved through the document submission. And once that's done, both the identity and the ATP credentials are issued. And then from that point forward, again, the wallet is making sure that the identity credential is there, but it's utilizing the ATP credential. And if there's ever any problems with that credential, it's very easy for us to then go in and revoke it. So there's a responsibility from the issuer side to continue to monitor the status of that license and information that's backing up the ATP status. So hopefully that summarized everything, Bob. I know we're getting to the top of the hour, so people might have to.
Yeah. So maybe this is a last. I was drawing over here on the side as I started to digest some of the things that you had been talking about, what Sharon had been talking about, and again, this whole ad hoc nature is something that I don't know whether it shocked me or as we started to work through DSCSA, but the traditional customer suppliers, somebody does a request, you onboard them, and then you have an interaction. Whereas here, what we're trying to do is offline onboarding, which is working with an issuer, and so you get all of that out of the way for each other, and then you can interact with anyone in this environment, make a request. They can cryptographically verify you and your authorization, and then the interaction can take place. So just as I like to draw when people are talking. So just a difference in the situation that we're in verification and tracing, and why we're where we are here with using credentials to authenticate and authorize. Any last questions before we close? if you do, feel free to contact us. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Hopefully it opened up some thoughts as far as where you're going in terms of being able to get yourself ready for verification and tracing. So thanks everyone for being part of this today. Again, I apologize for being late to the call.
Bob?
Yes.
Sorry, I did have one point, question to that point of tracing.
Sure, John.
You know, I know it's only when you have an issue that you're going to be tracing in the new world. But is there, I guess, industry thinking about testing that out? Because if you don't test it, when the time comes, you may run into problems and not realize it. Is there anything going on in the sandboxes on that, or?
Yeah. So there's been two things, two levels to that. One is that there's been two pilots. NABP put on a pilot. The Center for Supply Chain Security Supply Chain Studies is doing a pilot currently on tracing and testing that out. And then the second one is that the valid reasons for doing a trace, as I mentioned, is for an investigation. There is also another way to do it to kind of test, make sure that you're connected and that the other party can answer you. So yes, there is a way to you won't necessarily do a trace, but you'll make sure that you are connected and you're ready to do a trace if asked to do one.
Yeah, I guess my big concern is that, I know I asked about doing it in the sandbox. I mean, that to me is a first step, but to do it post implementation when everything's live in production is a little different ball game in this world, as you probably know.
Yeah.
I just wonder if anything going on, any tensions going on there, because I said until you do a trace, you can't really know if it's going to be successful or not under production circumstances. And unfortunately, it's one of those things where you're not going to be doing this on a regular basis, so it's going to be, like you said, an investigation that triggers it. You don't want to wait until that to find out, oops, I got problems.
Right.
So, okay.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
All right. Have a great day.